John, thanks so much, mate. Great to be with you guys. I'm just going to go ahead and let you know up front, my mum and dad are originally from the US. So although I was born in Adelaide, grew up in Australia, I have what I refer to as the Russell Crowe version of the accent. I have an Australian accent, but you can tell I just spent far too long living in America. But I've been back now for about 2.5 years, and I'm super stoked to be in Townsville for my very first ever visit to Townsville. I'm a New South Welshman, and I know that's not good here in Townsville to say that. I'm a Blues supporter. Please don't just discount everything I say from here on out. I promise I actually am a huge rugby league fanatic, and I love the fact that COVID, as awful as it's been, has given Queensland the gift of more rugby league than we've ever had in an entire year. I actually told John, I've been to more rugby league this year than I think all my years combined growing up. So super stoked to have that here in Queensland so much. And you guys have this fantastic stadium up here, which is so fun. So cool to be able to see it in person, not just on Foxtel like I normally do. So super cool. Hey, do me a favor as we kick off, and including those of you that are watching online, do me a favor, would you grab your phone really quickly? And I'd love for you to open up the text app on your phone. And here's what I'd like to ask you to do. I want to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to play along with a little bit of a quiz, a text-in quiz. The first question is this. It's just a yes or a no question. I want you to text the number up on the screen. I should be pointing to this side. Text this number up on the screen. Have you ever been on an airplane before? Now, some of you are thinking, Jason misspelled that word. That is the old school way of spelling airplane, apparently. But if you spell it differently, that's okay. Still, if you've flown in a plane before, text yes to 0499 37331. And if you have never flown in a plane, go ahead and text the word no to that same number. All right, here's the second question that I'm going to ask you about, okay? Whether you've flown or not before, I want you to text in your response to this particular question. What is your favorite or least favorite part of flying? Now, if we've got some pilots in the room, I know immediately I have not included all of the various phases of a flight, okay? So if you're a pilot, forgive me, I've only put up 6 of the phases. There's a very important one that we're going to talk about that's not on the screen. But if you've never flown before, I would like you to answer the question anyway, thinking or imagining, if you were to fly, what do you think your favorite or least favorite part of the flight would be? The takeoff, that part where, you know, the plane gets up at speed down the runway and you're just kind of hoping, holding onto your chair, that it gets going fast enough to lift off. Or maybe it's that part where I love that part of the flight actually, where you're kind of reclined, even though you're not allowed to recline your seat yet. You still are reclined, and it just feels great, the plane climbing up into the clouds. Or maybe it's the cruising part. Maybe that's your favorite part, I don't know. Maybe it's the descent. I remember last night as I was descending into Townsville, first time ever landing in Townsville, and then the landing. I love watching the speed of the lights as the plane is landing on the tarmac. And then maybe it's the final part 6, the taxi back to wherever your gate is. I don't know, maybe that's your favorite or least favorite. For me, when I'm taxiing, I'm always in that moment evaluating how good the flight was. In fact, last night, true story, I got my phone out and I turned it back off of airplane mode and I texted my wife and said, that's the smoothest flight I've ever had in my life. You can come check my phone if you want to verify that. Last night, I said, that is the smoothest flight I've ever had. So if you're playing along, the next question is a really, really important question. In fact, if you're playing along at home, you're watching online, or maybe you're watching in a cafe, great spot, by the way, to be watching church, a cafe, maybe down at the Strand. If you're watching online or here in the room, I'd love for you to think about this next question and kind of describe, by texting in just the number, if 2021 was a flight, how would you describe 2021 as the flight? So imagine, because there's 6 phases that we just talked about in a flight, imagine we're almost in November, so we're in the taxiing phase of 2021. If 2021 were a flight, We've kind of landed, and we're now taxiing to the gate of 2021 as a year, and we're evaluating, we're thinking about, hey, how good a flight was 2021? Was it a good flight? Would you text in one like I did last night when I texted my wife, hey, 2021 was smooth. Smoothest flight of my life. I don't think anybody probably is going to say that about 2021. Maybe you could. Maybe it was turbulent for you, or maybe you've been climbing in 2021. You feel like you're kind of onboarding, or you're climbing, you're ascending in maybe a work or a relationship, or your family seems to be climbing. Maybe financially you seem to be climbing. Hopefully you're not financially descending in 2021. Maybe that is the story for you. You text in number 4 or 5. Hopefully nobody texts in number 6, crashed and burned. Hopefully that's not anybody's response. But maybe if we're in a room this size and that many people that are watching online, there's probably somebody that would say, you know what, 2021 was kind of a crash and burn. By the way, number 5, banking, that's just when the flight turns. That's got nothing to do with like your actual, bank where you go to the ATM, get your money out. Banking is just when the plane turns a direction. And maybe your life this year feels like it's banking. Maybe you're turning in a certain direction. Here's what I know to be true about flights. When you're flying, it's oftentimes external forces, external things that are happening that cause you to describe a flight either as smooth or turbulent, or maybe climbing or descending or banking. Certainly external forces would be the thing that you would describe if you crashed and burned. And here's what I know to be true about life. Whether you're a church person or not a church person, whether you believe in Jesus or you're still trying to figure out the whole church, Jesus, Bible thing, is it all true or not? No matter what your background is, no matter how old or young you are, no matter if you're a male or female, it makes no difference what your background is. Most of our culture today, is an externally focused culture. Think about it. When you think about our culture, it's externally focused. Most people focus on these 3 things. What you do, oftentimes people will bring that up on the screen. What you do is something that people oftentimes ask you about. People oftentimes think about what they have, maybe their car or their job or their children or what possessions they have in life. It's what they do, what they have. And then oftentimes people are focused on what others think about them and oftentimes what they say about them. And so what that leads to, here's what externally focused cultures lead to. It leads to having people in the culture that want to do more so that they can have more, so that ultimately, as the saying goes, we do more so we can have more, and then ultimately it's so that people will think more and maybe even say more about us. So we tend to work a little bit more so that maybe we could have a little bit more car or a little bit more house or maybe a little bit more holiday, so that when we post our holiday on Instagram, people might think more of us. And they maybe even say more about us. Maybe they'd say, hey, have you seen Jason's new car? It looks really nice. Or maybe, did you see so-and-so, the holiday that they went on? I didn't even know you could leave the country yet, and they're already on a plane overseas. This is amazing. Like, we do more so that we can have more, so that hopefully people might think more and maybe even say more about us. Now, if you're not a church person, I want you just to lean in for a second, especially if you're watching online. If you're not a church person, I want to tell you a little secret about church people, about religious people. So all the religious people in the room, all the religious people watching online, you don't need to listen in. I'm going to tell all of the non-religious, non-church people a little secret about all of us. This idea of doing more so we can have more, so people might think more and even say more about us, this is something that religious people, again, lean in if you're not churchy, if you're not a follower of Jesus yet. Maybe you're on a journey of faith. Lean in, because this is a little secret you need to know about us. Church people, religious people, take this and we religiously complicate it. We complicate it religiously, and here's what we do. We actually do more for God to have a better relationship with God so that He might think and maybe even say something better about us. If we're being honest, if we're being honest, we oftentimes think, well, if I do a little bit more for God, maybe that will make me have a better relationship with him, maybe have a better standing with him, and then he might think more of me, and he might even actually say better things about me. All the church people, all the religious people, if we're being brutally honest, we might not say this, but we oftentimes live this way. And it's a system, if I can be completely transparent with you, it's a system that actually works to a certain point. It's a system that I kind of grew up with. And it's a system that I have led probably for the first 40 years of my life. I kind of led my relationship with God in this kind of a system. Now, I would never get up on a stage like this at a church and say, now, let me tell you, if you do more for God, then you'll have a better relationship with God. No. I would always say, Jesus did everything for us. When Jesus went to the cross, he paid the penalty, the payment for my sin, and you don't have to do anything to have a right relationship with God. That's what I would say. But then I would go out and I would live my life, and I would think to myself, well, if I do a little bit more for God, if I serve him, maybe if I tell more people about him, then somehow I'll have a better relationship with him. And that system served me well for the first 40 years of my life. In fact, that system took me all over the world doing ministry. People invited me to come and lead ministries, church camps, churches all over the world, speak in places, in conferences all over the world. That system worked well for me until around 2016. I was pastoring a church in Colorado, and in the church world, oftentimes people measure the success of a church by external factors. They say things like, well, a healthy church is a church that is growing in the number of people that come to its gatherings on a Sunday morning or throughout the week. And then oftentimes in the church world, they say, well, a healthy church, a successful church is a church where the finances of the church are constantly growing. They're up and to the right. Or the amount of people that they can get into small groups during the week, little connect groups or community groups, they're adding people and they're adding groups all the time. And at this church in Colorado, all of the external measurements were all up and to the right. In fact, I had only been leading the church for about 18 months, and we had more than doubled the attendance at the church in 18 months. We had tripled the amount of people that were connected into community groups, and our giving was the highest it had ever been in the history of the church. So externally, everything was looking great. But internally, my life was a mess. In fact, the growth of the church had contributed to so much inner turmoil and turbulence. I'll never forget, one night, my wife and I were walking around our neighborhood, and I was so frustrated with some of the things that were happening in the church, mostly relationship challenges because of the growth of the church. There were challenges with the staff, and there were challenges with some of the leaders in the church. And I remember being so angry at God, I took my glasses off, yelled, swore, and snapped my glasses in half. That's how frustrated and angry I was with God. But on the outside, externally, everything was up and to the right. Any person looking at it would have said, wow, what a success that leader is doing in that particular church. It was in that moment that I decided something had to change. Something had to be different. I reached out to a friend of mine who was a pastor of a large church an hour north of our city in another city. And he said, Jason, it's totally normal what you're experiencing, first of all. And then he said, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, a guy named Lance Witt. And Lance introduced me to a concept that I had never really heard of before. See, most of the training that I had received as a leader and as somebody helping to create ministries and to grow a church or grow a camp or a conference center, most of the things that I was trained in were all external things. How to speak publicly, how to get people into groups, how to encourage people to give financially. All of these were external things. And Lance introduced me to this idea of soul care. And he described, I love this definition. Lance describes soul care as this: it's tending to the garden of your inner life. I would say that I had been trained to tend to not just the garden, but the forest of my external life, or the farm of my external world. But nobody had taught me how to tend to the garden of my inner life. And here's what I discovered over the last 5 years, and in that moment, as he was encouraging me to begin to tend to the garden of my inner life, I discovered this truth, and it's a powerful, powerful truth. And I hope if you don't get anything else today, I hope you walk away with at least this one simple truth. The health of your internal life will eventually be revealed in your external life. That moment walking around the neighborhood, snapping my glasses, swearing at God, being so frustrated, was my internal life, the unhealth of my internal life, finally being revealed in my external life. The good news for me is that I wasn't the first person that has experienced this. In fact, this has been a tension since the very first followers of Jesus. Every follower of Jesus has had this tension, has had this challenge between the external and the internal. And even if you're not a follower of Jesus, we live in a culture that has really challenged and encouraged us to simply focus on our external life without taking care of our internal life. So even if you're not a follower of Jesus today, here's what I want to encourage you to do. Just lean in for a second to what Jesus is about to teach us. Because I think even if you're not sure about who he is, I think that even in listening and leaning into what Jesus is going to say, I think it could help you as you look at your life, not just from the external, but from the internal also. It's a famous story of Jesus and his early followers in the first century. And they were moving from one village to the next. In fact, they used to hang out together. They'd go on long walks and they'd go from village to village. There was 12 of these guys that traveled with Jesus. They were kind of like his posse. And when they would come into a town, they would oftentimes get invited into somebody's home. And this story actually tells the way it would happen when Jesus would travel. Jesus wouldn't go into a town and rent out like the whole floor of a hotel and all of his guys would move in for the crusade or the conference or anything. He would get invited into people's homes, and they wouldn't just invite him over for a meal, but they would actually invite him and the crew to stay there and spend a few days with them. The story that we're about to read is written by a guy named Luke. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, just really quickly, there are 4 accounts of Jesus' life, 4 biographies that we have recorded for us. But what we understand is that there were actually many more accounts of Jesus' life. In fact, in Luke's account, at the beginning of the account, he says these words: "There are many people that have told the story of Jesus, but I want to give you an accurate story of what happened in Jesus' life." Luke was a doctor, and so he was into all the details, and he recorded many of the details. And in this particular story, there are some details that I think are important for us to take a look at. Luke begins telling this story. He says this: "As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home." Not just to Jesus, but the whole crew. Remember, I said they didn't book out a hotel room. They got invited into people's homes. And the story goes on. It says that this lady named Martha, she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Now, notice the detail that Luke gives us. Don't miss this. This is important. Jesus in the first century was a rabbi. And rabbis had followers, these 12 guys. This would not have been unusual for him to have disciples, or a great word that we use in our English language is the word apprentice. Think of these 12 guys as apprentices to Jesus the rabbi. They wanted to become like Jesus. Not just listen to what he taught, but they actually wanted to become like the rabbi. Now, most rabbis, when you came and they began to teach, people wanted to sit next to the rabbi on the left or the right. In fact, there's another story of these 12 guys fighting over who was going to sit on the left or the right of Jesus. Notice in the story, notice what Luke records for us about Mary. Mary wasn't sitting next to Jesus. In fact, in the story, Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus. This is so powerful because a person that wanted to be seen with Jesus would not have wanted to sit at Jesus' feet. They would have wanted to sit on the left or the right-hand side of Jesus, but Mary didn't want to be seen as being near Jesus. Mary actually wanted to listen and learn not just the lessons that Jesus taught, but she also wanted to discover the lifestyle that Jesus lived. In fact, I'm convinced as a follower of Jesus, if you don't adopt some of the lifestyle that Jesus lived, it's impossible to live out the lessons that he taught. If you don't begin to adopt some of the lifestyle practices that Jesus actually lived by, it's near impossible to live out the lessons that he taught us. So if you're a follower of Jesus, I want to encourage you, don't just look at the lessons Jesus taught. Begin to adopt some of the lifestyle that he actually lived. Mary, sitting at Jesus' feet, was actually frustrating her sister Martha. The story goes on that says this, that Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made for the meal and to house these guys. And then the story goes on, not only was Martha distracted, but Martha actually had some real guts. Martha's a strong personality. Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made, so much so that she came to Jesus and asked him, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? And then Martha doubles down. Now, this is pretty gutsy. You got to imagine. This is Jesus, okay? I don't know about you, but as a follower of Jesus, I don't know that I would have come to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, don't you care that my sister's not doing anything? But then Martha doubles down. She doesn't just kind of challenge Jesus with the question. She now begins to tell Jesus what to do. I don't know about you. I'm not sure I would have had the guts to tell Jesus what to do. But Martha says to Jesus, tell my sister to help me. Tell her to help me. And then I love the response that Jesus gives to Martha. If you're familiar with this story, don't let the familiarity of the story allow you to miss the point that Jesus is trying to make. Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. And then Jesus doubles down. Not just few things. Jesus doubles down and says, or indeed, only one. And then this last line, this is a powerful line. It's like Jesus doubles down, and then he triples down on Martha. He says this, Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Notice that Jesus didn't say what Martha's doing is unimportant and you shouldn't do it. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is just saying there's a priority here. I believe that Jesus is saying this to Mary and to Martha, and I think he's saying it to all of us, especially those of us that are followers of Jesus. The principle is this, it's a priority that being with Jesus is actually greater than doing for Jesus. It's not that doing for Jesus is not important. That's incredibly important. Jason, don't stop doing what you're doing, but allow what you're doing to come out of a being with me. That's what Jesus is saying to Martha, that being with Jesus is far greater than doing for Jesus. Jesus himself actually said it. He said it this way. He described himself as kind of a grapevine. He said this, that I'm the vine and you're the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. And then this final statement is a powerful statement. Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Ultimately, what he's saying to us this morning is this, that everything you do for Jesus has to flow out of a being with Jesus. But if you're just focused on the externals, the doing, eventually your internal health will be revealed in your external life. It's inevitable. So I want to share just some practical applications that have been incredibly helpful for me over the last 5 years. I want to give you 4 practical applications as we wrap up our conversation this morning. And even if you're not a follower of Jesus, please don't miss this. Even if you're not a follower of Jesus yet, even if you're on the journey of faith, all 4 of these things I believe are something that you can do on your journey towards Jesus that can transform the internal part of your life. And here I want to say a couple of things before I share what these 4 things are. The first thing that makes me nervous about sharing these 4 applications is this. I get nervous that people would think more highly of me for these practices than they ought to. I'm just another guy on my journey towards following Jesus that has stumbled across some practices that have been helpful for me, and I'm just passing them along to you. So please don't think any more highly of me than you ought to. Number 2, I get nervous about sharing this because sometimes when you look at a list of practices like this, oftentimes people will begin to use it as a checklist. And they may actually begin worshiping the practices instead of the person of Jesus. You get to the point where you forget about the fact that the practices are just to put you at the feet of Jesus. The whole point of the practice is to position you like Mary at the feet of Jesus. The practice is not the point. It's positioning yourself at Jesus' feet that is the priority. And then the last thing that I want to say before I share the practices is that I get nervous about sharing these because I think sometimes people will think, well, I've got to start doing all of those at once. Over the last 5 years, I have gradually, progressively begun to do some of these practices that have been so transformative, and I would encourage you to take it slowly. Jesus was never in a rush, and I believe as followers of Jesus, we can follow him slowly as well. So here's the first practice that's been incredibly helpful for me. I kind of refer to these as my gardening practices in tending to the garden of my soul. Number 1, I've begun to practice every day, spending a lot of time in just silence and solitude. We live in a busy, noisy world, and I've begun to discover that the practice of just being silent and still before the Lord has been incredibly transforming for me internally. For those that are not followers of Jesus, for those that are outside the church, a lot of people are talking about mindfulness these days and how incredibly helpful mindfulness can be and the positive things that it can do to your life. Even if you're not a follower of Jesus, I think spending some time in silence and solitude every day can be incredibly helpful. In fact, as it relates to the gardening practices of our soul, the way I would describe silence and solitude, it's kind of like sunlight for your soul. When you are sitting quietly with Jesus, it's kind of like sunlight. You can't see what it's doing to a plant, but it is feeding that plant, and silence and solitude has done the same thing for my soul. It feeds my soul even though I can't see what it's doing. The second practice that's been so life-giving for our family, not just for me personally, but our whole family, is the practice of what's called Sabbath. It's just taking a 24-hour period every single week, putting down all of the work, paid and unpaid work, and just delighting in God's goodness to us as his children. Not being described or known for what we do, but recognizing that we are not loved because of what we do. We are loved by God because of who we are as his children. I've noticed that Sabbath for us as a family has been a lot like watering a garden. Every week, my wife takes some of our plants inside the home and she puts them in our bathroom, in our shower, and she begins to water these plants. Sometimes I go in there to have a shower on Saturday and can't find any room to have a shower. Sabbath has been like that to our souls. It's this refreshing replenishment every single week. The third practice that's been incredibly helpful is something called the daily office. It's just a moment multiple times throughout the day where we pause and reflect, put down our work, put down the distractions of the day, and just take a moment to be with Jesus and just reflect on our day, reminding ourselves again that I'm not what I do, I am who I am because of who I am with Jesus. This has been a lot for me, like kind of weeding out the unimportant things of my soul. Oftentimes when I'm in those moments of reflection, it's like God reveals something to me and he says, hey, you just need to pull that out of your life. You need to set that aside. These daily offices have been incredibly helpful. And then the fourth one, the last one, is this thing called Lectio Divina. It's just a fancy term for reading the Bible slowly. I was taught as a child to read large portions of Scripture. Maybe you even were invited to read through the Bible in an entire year. And I remember thinking by February how shameful and guilty I felt because I was already 2 weeks behind on my reading plan. What I've discovered is that slow, repetitive reading of small portions of Scripture has been transformative for my soul. It's like putting fertilizer in your garden and helping the plants to grow. So here's what I want to invite you to do. I want you to take your phone, and I'm going to put my number, or you should already have my number in your phone because you were texting earlier. And I want you to do two things. I skimmed over those 4 practices. Each one of those practices in and of themselves, we could spend an hour or more talking about. And so here's what I want to invite you to do. I'd like you to pick one of the 4 practices that kind of stood out to you as I was explaining them briefly. And I would love for you to just text me your email address, whatever the best email address is for you, and then which number is the one that you would maybe like to begin to think about. Some of you overachievers, you're going to put 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't do 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? Just pick a number. And I would like to send you, as a resource, I'd like to send you an email, just a PDF, that helps you take a step in the direction of one of those 4 practices. A resource that you could follow with some videos and some instructions that would just help you to begin to apply those practices in your life. I want to finish up with a great quote from one of my favorite authors, a guy by the name of Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen says this about spiritual identity. He says, spiritual identity means we are not what we do, we are not what we have, or what people say about us. We are the beloved daughters and sons of God. In an externally focused culture, don't miss this, in an externally focused culture that's constantly looking at what we do, what we have, what people think or say about us, your Heavenly Father, even if you are not a follower of Jesus yet, your Heavenly Father does not think of you by what you do, what you have, or what others think or say about you. He thinks of you as a beloved son or daughter because that's what you are. So this end of the year, as we begin to go into 2022, I want to ask you this question or maybe challenge you with this thought. Here's a flight plan for 2022. Here's your flight plan. What if you focused more on who you need to become and less on what you think you need to get done? What if you focused on that as you move into a new year? What if I focused more on who does God want me to become and less on what I think I need to get done? Father, thank you. Thank you for reminding us this morning of this incredible story of Mary and Martha who had this struggle, this tension that all of us feel, every single one of us in this externally focused culture that we live in, God. We're constantly drawn to all the things that we think we need to get done. And yet you call us to focus on who you want us to become. I pray that you would help each of us to know what it is that you want us to do with what we've heard today. And I pray that you'd give us the courage to take a step to do just that. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.